And I think that this is also a nice opportunity to bring together and try to propose some dialogue between different research agendas in the field of environmental studies that I conduct with other colleagues in the past at least 10 years. Right? Part of my doctoral dissertation, part of, well, some chapters, some papers, and as we saw yesterday with Marco's presentation, she brings three different projects, and not always happens that you are invited to a conference and take the chance to share and to imagine immersion between different parts of our research. So I understand that this is a moment to exchange with you, with the fellows, with Phil, and with the part of the public present here. So the proposal is it's a crossroad between democracy, development, and environmental mobilization. And I have like a big research open question that I have already think for some particular project that is always part of my research interest. And this is why and how does environmental mobilization challenge the principles and procedures of democracy. So this is what I'm trying to share with all of you today. Yeah, this is a short roadmap that I want to discuss with you. The first part of the presentation is focused on why is the link between democracy, development, and the environment relevant, and why it's necessary or why it's important to show or to look at Latin America and the Caribbean. What elements of our region are important to think in these three elements analyzing together, right? Democracy, development, and environmental issues. Then I want to share these two main challenges, that is multiscalarity and intergenerational equity. And finally, the last part of my presentation is focused on the how. Right? I understand that those two challenges are fostered through environmental mobilization, right? So I want to share the behind the scene of the concept of environmental mobilization I'm working on. And then I want to also explore some particular types or modes of knowledge involved in environmental mobilization. And as a starting point, I understand that there's a crossroad between not democracy, natural change. A natural state is the change, and it's dynamic and in continuous transformation, right? And we can imagine, or we can think in democracy as a regime, a political regime open to new demands. And obviously, a new demand that every single year gains much more presence on public opinion, public agenda, and social agenda too. It's the environmental concerns, right? Since the 60s, from this wonderful book of Rachel Carson in '62, Silent Spring. If you never read it, I recommend, because it's a wonderful book. To the conference in Rio, from limits to growth in the early 70s, to the IPCC experts, right? There's a rise at the global and the local government level in the environmental concerns. So in this crossroad of democracy as a regime open to new demands, a new discussion, and this environmental concern, I identified that there's many elements to think in this crossroad between environmental development and democracy, right? Well, there's a so-called green political theory that since the 80s has been trying to think and propose different contribution and theoretical approaches to explore, among other issues, right, the impact of environmental problems on democratical foundations and practices, as well as the compatibility between environmentalism and fundamentally like liberal democracy, right? But after a certain latency, there's a new wave of works on the intersection between democracy and the environment, right? And I think that this is interesting, and it's necessary to pay much more attention in this new wave of environmental studies, right? But also, it's possible to identify, as Phil mentioned yesterday, participation is a core value for democracy, right? And since the beginning of the discussion on environmental, there's like a clear recognition, right, an institutional and multilateralism recognition of the importance of environmental information and environmental and democracy link, right? On Stockholm Conference, the Brundtland Report, Agenda 21 in Rio, Centennial Report, Aarhus Convention, they are all different institutional bodies that claim for institutional participation, for environmental information, and for an active involvement of civil society in environmental issues, right? And really, really important is the wave of constitutional enshrinement of environmental rights, not only in the region, but all across the world, right? The people, we the people as citizenship, we have the constitutional right in many, many countries for a clean, clear, and healthy environment. But obviously, in the real practice, we still facing like gaps of implementation, right? But maybe we can discuss a little bit of those later, right? But also there's like a group or different empirical works that shows how the democratic deliberation has proved to have positive effects on environmental risk management, institutional legitimacy, and democratical progress, right? But also social involvement and public participation usually expands the arena for the debate on the environmental issue. Also makes environmental rights effective, that is related that implementation gaps, and increase the levels of social and political empowerment, right? But still, I think, and later we can discuss when I explain these two main challenges, that, well, there's still some elements that are not possible, or it's really, really hard to process through democracy institutions or democracy procedures, right? So the second part to discuss is why Latin America and the Caribbean it's relevant. And I identify, and obviously it's open to the discussion, of course, that we have economic and development reasons to identify the relevance of this link. We have democratic reasons, and obviously we have environmental reasons, right? Well, despite different receipts and despite different economical perspective, I think that most of us can agree that there's a clear link between economical growth and development, right? But if we saw, I saw, sorry, this is, well, but the regular recipe to solve underdevelopment, it's economical growth. But if we check the data, at least with one only index is GDP per capita, we can see that the gap between United States and Central European countries and Latin America and the Caribbean is expanding, right? All the receipts that points out to argue that it's necessary to close the gap in terms of economical well-being between the development countries and the other countries, on the underdevelopment countries. Well, it's clear that it's not being resolving in the last years.
and the tendency shows all the opposite, right? So, well, another part to understand the links between development and natural resources also shows that the share in terms of GDP of the total natural resources rent in Latin America is really, really higher than United States or European Union, right? So the environmental is much more important to think about development and economical activities than in the other countries. Well, and similar trends you can identify if you check agriculture, forestry, and fishing as a value added of GDP, right? Well, we saw Latin America with a really, really higher ratios than the other countries, right? Also, it's possible to speak about democratical reason to think about this relationship between democracy, environmental, and development. And in 2022, Shumerini and Lupu shows with an interesting report that Latin America democracy is under a process of erosion of trust, right? And dissatisfaction with democracy is growing up in the region. And one of the, at least for this discussion, I think that is a really interesting finding, is that when they check the individual level, they identify that those people with lowest socioeconomic and educational levels express lower support for democracy, right? And this is clear what Phil shares yesterday, that there is really a clear link between democracy and development, and still happen in our region. But also, those people has been victims of crime, corruption, or have negative economical experience, or they do not approve their governments express lower support for democracy, right? And also there's a less disapproval of coups and less support for elections. And I think that this is a call of attention for all of us, right? And finally, there's a lot of environmental reasons to discuss and for the debate of these three elements analyzing together, right? Well, Latin America and the Caribbean are one of the most biodiversity regions in the world. And in Latin America, well, these 5 spots are included in South America, right? Hotspots of biodiversity are small portion of territory that concentrate higher values of biodiversity in terms of animal, insects, plants, seeds, well, including 2 are part of Colombia, right? Chocó, Magdalena, and the tropical Andes, right? And also, I imagine that many of you are checking during these days the COP16 in Colombia, and the biodiversity debate is in the public agenda, right? But also, as we discussed a few slides ago, there's a high share of natural resources extraction in the economy. Well, this is part of the extractivism or the neo-extractivism that authors like Maristela Vampa, Alberto Acosta, they analyze during the last decades for the Latin American situation, right? But also, the Latin American, the Caribbean, they have like a strategic location of the region in the context of energy transition. So key minerals like lithium, copper, but also some particular advantage for non-conventional renewable energies like solar, wind, hydrogen are focused on Latin America. So we can expect much more pressure on natural resources than the previous year. So altogether, it's allow us to argue that Latin America, it's really important to think in terms of democracy development, right? In terms of environmental, of course. Well, And finally, but really, really important, well, Latin America has one of the highest level of environmental conflict around the world, right? Well, I have two maps here. One is these red points are from the Observatorio de Conflictos Mineros de América Latina, is mining conflict observatory of Latin America. These are only mining conflicts in the region. Just check Mexico with 68 conflicts active in this moment. In the right map, it's a wonderful work led by Joan Martinez Alier, and it's the Environmental Justice Atlas. And they are mapping in a collective effort, they are mapping different, not only mining conflict, they are land, forestry, water, sanitation, housing, well, a different types of environmental conflict in the region. And it's amazing the amount of environmental conflicts active in the region. And finally, Latin America is the most dangerous region for being an environmental leader, right? All around the world. And it means murder. If you are an environmental leader, you have a highest risk to be murdered in this social protest or in this social contestation, right? Well, cases like Berta Cáceres, Chico Méndez, even here in Colombia, it has the highest number in the region. Now, in Latin American terms, Brazil, Colombia, Honduras usually has a lot of environmental leaders killed year by year, right? Well, and after all this scenario, I argue that there are still two different challenges in which environmental mobilization challenge the principles of democracy. And these are the multiscalarity and the intergenerational equity, right? Sorry. And I want to share some particular ideas around these two main concepts. So for multiscalarity, I understand the multiscale component as the different scale brought into play in a particular conflict, right? And I argue that this multiscalarity cross, right, or traverse the environmental mobilization in three distinct or three different and specific instances. First, because the distributive implication of environmental dynamics, right? It involves the unequal or the uneven distribution of the cost and the benefits of the exploitation of natural resources, right? And well, obviously there's different literature around this issue, but well, once again, we can quote Martinez Alier, right? Because this dynamic usually, and the most part of the cases, it overloading the local arena with the damages, right? While deriving the profits or the benefits to superior levels, right? And these superior levels can be used, like Phil shared yesterday, to support some particular distributive policies, right? In Argentina, for example, with the rent of the soybean, they pay some particular redistributional politics, right? But in Bolivia, usually too, with the rent of the gas, they pay the Juancito Pinto bono. So this policy has been part of the left-side governments in Latin America, but the local communities support the most part environmental damages, right? But also the profits cannot be used at the local or at the national level, but usually it's part of a much more complex process of transnational accumulation, right? A simple example of this is our Canadian mining companies. They are all across Latin America, and they create value for their main companies based mostly in Toronto, and while the damage is on the environment, the use of water, the exploitation of the natural resources are on the local level at Latin America, right? The second element of multiscalarity, it's the impossibility of a strictly overlapping between territorial divisions like national, subnational, provincial, and municipality with specific environmental impacts on a given territory, right? And this illustrates the interjurisdictional nature of environmental problem. Well, a simple example of this is a contamination of a basin, right? If you contaminate in the upper side, in the upper part of the basin, the people who lives in the lower part of the basin suffer the contamination. And well, a democratic question is, well, the people from the lowest part of the basin that suffer the contamination, they have the right to environmental participation related to that conflict or not, only in the part of the contaminations happens, right? Well, this is all for the discussion. And third, it's because there's some kind of lack of agreement, institutional, but also political, a lack of agreement about which scale can or should be used to solve an environmental conflict. Because in the different experience, right, the actors involved in the conflicts make a strategic use of the scales to achieve their goals. So forcing local resolutions, like shows Thea Riofranco, escalating to subnational or national level, or even through transnational advocacy, right? It's not clear which is the formal scale to solve an environmental problem. And this is part of the dispute. So it's not possible to know ex ante which will be the scale in which the conflict will solve or should be solved. So based on these peculiarities, and as additional question, I wonder who and on what scale of action should make decision over issues associated to the environment, right? Well, which people, in what moment they have the right or no have the right to take democratic deliberation about environmental issues, right? And the second big challenge for me is the intergenerational equity, right? The principle of international equity has been present since the 70s, mostly. But with the Brundtland report in '87 has been much more important in environmental discussion. But this principle of international equity implies that the enjoyment of a healthy environment should comprise both present and future generations, right? And it's important because this principle is closely bound to the idea of citizenship, right? Because the time it reinforced the collective character of environmental issues, because environmental enjoyment is not reducible to individual enjoyment, right? And in the last few years, the intergenerational character of environmental has been problematized by the emergence of youth mobilization, right? And I think that the youth mobilization, a dissident youth in terms of O'Brien, Selborn, and Hayward, they put in agenda with a very, very strong discussion the idea of the intergenerational justice or equity. But mostly, this not only they claim with an active concern about the future generation, but also by pointing, right, at the older generation as accountability for the environmental damage, right? At the same time, they demand a higher participation in environmental decision-making, right? And probably one of the most emblematic examples of this youth mobilization is Greta, right? Well, they say, they denounce that the older generation are failing us, right? And this is, for me, this is a wonderful phrase, right? It is we, young people and future generation, we are going to suffer the most from the climate and ecological crisis. The older generation are failing us. And the political leaders are failing us. But we'll be watching. and holding them accountable, right? Once again, accountability, one of the main values of democracy that Phil present yesterday. And once again, as an additional discussion or an additional question is how to make the intergenerational character of the environmental issues operative through democratical procedures. Well, this is the behind the scene of environmental mobilization concept. This is the part of why. Is the part of the how, right? How the environmental mobilization challenge the principles of democracy, right? And in 2023, I guess, Oxford University Press launched this wonderful book, the Oxford Handbook of Latin American Social Movements, in which Federico Rossi invited to me and Ricardo Gutierrez, my advisor and the actual dean of the School of Politics for Government in UNSAM, to write a chapter about environmental social movements in the region, right, in Latin America and the Caribbean. And well, we took like a little bit controversial decision because we seek to answer, to one extent, the concept of social movement is the more appropriate to understand and to deal with environmental mobilization in Latin America and the Caribbean. So our starting point was the conceptual distinction between environmental mobilization and environmental movement or social movement. So to think about environmental mobilization, we building upon Tilly's classic definition of mobilization as an active participation in public life. And to test the concept of social movement, we work with Mario Diani definition. It's a classic definition of 1992. And as a general trend, where we review a huge body of literature for the region, and we identify three main ways of environmentalism in the region. In the first part, or the first wave, was like an early environmental activism, and it was characterized by some types of elites, like middle upper class or upper class with ties and links and access to state resources, and also clear links with NGO, with international NGOs. And their goals were mostly focused on conservationism and the protection of biodiversity, right? Without no much collective action, no dispute, and a very cooperative relationship with the state. A second wave, mostly in the 80s, it's the emergence of local and grassroots organization. And mostly of this group was denounced the injustice distribution of the cost and the benefits of environmental or the exploitation of natural resources, right? One of the main examples of this type of groups was Chico Mendes, right, in the Amazonia in Brazil. It's like an emblematic example of this second wave. And finally, this is in the 21st century, it's a third wave in which it's possible to identify a merging of movements. It's what Eduardo Viola calls the environmentalization of social movements, right? It's the merging between environmental movements with peasant and indigenous groups, right? It's a merging of movements, right? And in this third wave, we can identify like Alberto Acosta, Siveci, Maristelas Vampa, right? So in the review of the literature, we identify different views on what I understand that they are the key dimension of environmental mobilization, right? The types of groups involved and the resources mobilized, the issues in questions and the frames, the modes of action and participation, once again, the scales, that for me, it's a very, very important element, the relationships with the states, and the influence of politics and economical context. But to sum up, we find that the notion of social movement is used by most authors in this literature review that we conduct with Ricardo in a vague or even in a contradictory ways. So we also find that the three components of a social movement following Mario Diani definition, like is involvement in a given conflict, informal network of interaction, and a common collective identity are not necessary altogether. Even in those few works that try to make a case for the existence of environmental movements. So, and this is a little bit controversial decision we took with Ricardo, that in a handbook about social movements, we argue that the social movements is not the soundest one, the concept of social movement is not the soundest one to grasp the singularities of Latin American and the Caribbean environmentalism. So we define environmental mobilization as a collective action aiming to influence in a contention or institutionalized ways the decision regarding the political and economical regulation of the interaction between humans being and the environment. So, and we argue that this definition is flexible enough to capture the eminent complex scenario in which disparate actors with different identities and different visions converge in manifold environmental issues, operate at multiple scales, and resort to different modes of action in order to achieve a common goal. And finally, to share a new part of my research agenda, I want to present some briefly reflection on the kind of knowledge that's coming to play into environmental mobilization, right? And this is related, for me, it's a key issue of collective action because it talks about the types of resources, right, that the social actors uses in mobilization. And in this particular case, I understand these resources in the terms of knowledge, right? Environmental information is important in terms of democratic input, I argue, right? But also it's important because mobilization, I guess, is inevitably mediated by a minimum of information, right? In other words, if you don't know nothing about some particular environmental situation, you will not to be mobilized, right? Or no one mobilized in the face of something they do not know, right? Or if they do not have a minimum, a list of information that allow them to problematize the situation, right? So it's necessary. And also, as we discussed a couple of minutes ago, the notion of environmental information, it's well recognized by institutional multilateralism organizations, by national constitution, by national environmental laws, and even now with the Escazú agreement for the region, environmental information, it's a key part of the equation. So, but I argue that this notion of information is a little bit limited to capture some of the facets that often unfold in environmental mobilization. So I propose to work from the perspective of the knowledge. And I think that knowledge is important because it is closely linked to forms of collective socialization and learning that are related with the particularities of the political system, the social cultural tradition, and the legal and the normative schemes that can be invoked as part of the political contest. So I identify 3 types of knowledge that come into play in environmental mobilization. This is traditional local knowledge, the technical knowledge, and the legal institutional knowledge. And most part of these findings are based on my works on the Argentinian cases, but I understand that this idea can travel easily to other particular conflicts in Latin America. The first is the traditional and local knowledge. And I distinguish between traditional and local because I identify that it's not the same, right? Traditional knowledge is strictly linked with indigenous people, right? They have like a particular relation with the nature, with the environment. This particular way to relate to relationship with the nature is part of the style of life. They has been during years and centuries in a similar way in a world of respect with the nature. And obviously, with the advance of neo-extractivism frontiers in Latin America, one of the most exposed territories are indigenous lands, right? So, and the second type of knowledge is local knowledge. And it's not similar because they are not subsistency activities. It's not related to subsistence economical activities. It's possible to identify at least three main characteristics. One, it's this local knowledge. It's related to some particular economical activity that it's part of capitalism scheme, right? It's part of capitalism production, right? And even in some cases, it's oriented to global exportation, right? The second part of the local knowledge is that these local activities that express this local knowledge, they are really important in terms of tax revenues for the governments, and especially in terms of job creation. So they took like a interesting portion of the economical dynamics of some particular region, right? And then we can mention some examples, right, of this. And finally, this local knowledge associated with some particular economical activity, it's also express some kind of identification with the people, right? So for me, I will always try to share the example of Mendoza, the province of Mendoza, and the winery industry, right? And this is local knowledge, and this local knowledge is put into play into environmental conflict because the wine industry, the agricultural small businessman related to the wine, they reject mining in Mendoza. And they reject mining, and there's also, because, well, like 7 or 8% of subnational GDP is explained by wine industry in Mendoza, but also because the defense of the water, rejecting open pit mining in Mendoza, was related, well, on one side, like water is life, but water is need to keep working on the productive ways in which Mendoza expressed more than a century ago, right? And this is very interesting because in other places like, well, Tambo Grande, in Tambo Grande was in Peru, probably the first social unrest against the mining. The small and the middle businessmen, they cultivate and export mangoes and lemons. And this is like a very important active actor in environmental discussion. So, and the people and the government, the local government, they pay attention for these people because they represent tax revenues from these activities, but also has a portion of identity in terms of relation with this particular type of production. The second one is the technical knowledge, right? And I think that technical knowledge has become much important during the following years in environmental conflicts. And I also identify 3 different stages. One, it's like ignorance about technical knowledge. So when the mining companies arrives, at least in Argentina or in other countries in Latin America, usually the people do not know nothing about the difference of the new big mining with the artisan or the craft mining, because it's super technical how the company use the water to split the mineral from the rock using cyanide, for example, right? And this is, well, there's some part of ignorance or no knowledge about the technical process. The second time was like a socialization of knowledge in which people from university, professors, technical from the government, from the provincial or from the local government, they share some elements of technical knowledge to understand the type of environmental conflict. And finally, there's like a third stage, a much more mature stage, in which local organization and grassroots organization use technical knowledge to confront the government and the companies. So maybe there has not a lot of examples, but in some occasions, the people from the assemblies, from the local grassroots groups, they reject the evaluation of environmental report using technical knowledge. They say, no, you will use much more water than you say in this informa, in this report, right? And this is very dangerous, and we don't want to be part of this. And there's like a controversial, it's like an expert controversial, right? But not only between technicals from the government of the companies. This controversial is between local people and the government or the companies. And finally, is the legal institutional knowledge. And I think that the legal knowledge is probably, at least for me, one of the main interesting findings of this environmental mobilization. It has been a progressive process in which local people, local organizations take and use in a strategic way a legal framework. And its legal framework, it's used in two big differences. One, it's a strategic use of the legal rights, right? Mostly with advocacy, mostly with ties with environmental lawyers, and probably it's, well, I always forget the word in English, that it's amparo, it's a legal amparo, it's acción de amparo.
Special protection right, like
well, something similar, yeah, but yeah. Yeah, to stop some particular activity, right? And then finally, the judicial system will determine if it is valid or not. But they use the legal tools in a strategic way. And even in some cases, they combine legal action with contention politics. There's a case in Argentina in which the El Algarrobo Assembly, that is a grassroots organization of Andalgalá in Catamarca, they present a legal amparo action that scaling up to the Supreme Court of Justice in Argentina. And, well, the Supreme Court take the case, but never decide. So what they do? They march to the capital city and they organize like a campament in front of the Supreme Court to pressure to give a sentence. And they get it. So, but they are combining contention action with legal strategies. So, and finally, the institutional knowledge, well, it's related with the legal system, right? Yesterday, Majo said that in Bogota, there's a lot of institutional knowledge, institutional tools for gender policies, but it's necessary to appropriate and to learn how to use it in a strategic way. So, well, and some concluding remarks and open ideas for the discussions. Once again, Latin America occupies a central place in the new discussion of energy transition, a new matrix of electromobility, and the fight against climate change. But at least for me, it is also clear that this pressure on natural resources does not allow us for sustainable development on the long term, nor for a broad and democratic environmental participation, and nor for an effective environmental protection. So, but once again, I therefore understand that democracy as a political regime and an institutionalized way of resolving difference is a central instrument to moving forward, moving towards more just and sustainable scenarios in the region. But to do so, three elements, at least three, I identified that it's necessary. First, it's reversing the pattern of social participation in environmental issues, right? When we check the literature on, we analyze different empirical cases, we identify that in some particular cases, the local people, small communities, NGOs, they achieve their goals. Yeah, not always, but in some occasions happens. But this right to participate in environmental conflicts is after a long, long story of fights and contention politics. So for me, it's necessary to pass from environmental contention to institutional participation as a substantive right, not just a formal one. So in other words, it's a similar experience than in other fields of social conflict, right? They only participate who claims and who fights, right? And if we reverse the pattern, I think that it's possible to have better results. And the second one, or the second idea is, well, we need to demand more from democracy by increasing the complexity of democracy itself, as Rosanne Ballon points out, both in its institutions and procedures and in the forms of expression of society. And finally, we still need political creativity and commitment. And I think that Latin America, it's a proper scenario for political creativity, like PACA shares today with the Séptima Papeleta or with the blocks of cares in Bogotá. I think that in Latin America, we have a lot of problems, of course, but we still have an interesting portion of political creativity to change some parts of this complex scenario. And also, obviously, we still need a lot of commitment. Okay, thanks a lot. It has been a pleasure to share this words with you.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I had a question about when thinking about how to include the environment, if we understand that as a sort of assemblage of other than human beings into democratic systems. Did you have any thoughts about sort of the kind of rights of nature movement in terms of, I mean, particularly here in Colombia, but in New Zealand, the idea of that you give obviously a river or a mountain rights under the law. And I mean, a big critique of that is that rather than actually sort of decolonizing law in that sense, it just reproduces a sort of liberal idea of personhood, this time applied to a natural entity. And also the idea that, I mean, agrarian reform, for example, has been a demand of indigenous and peasant movements for decades, but when it has been applied, it's often done in a very unsatisfactory way, in a way that upholds an anthropocentric idea of land as a commodity. So my question is, how did you have any thoughts about sort of how you might include environment in as a broader concept in legal systems?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. It's a really interesting question, and obviously it includes much more complexity in all of this discussion. In terms of the rights of the planet, of the Mother Earth, of the Pachamama, right? I think that it's really important, and I think that also is part of political creativity, but also reflect the idea of one of the most mobilized groups in this process of environmental mobilization that is indigenous group, right? And examples of the Constitution of Ecuador, well, they has been recognized by during the reform of 2008, but also in the Bolivian case, something similar happens in 2011. And I think that is important in both, at least in two directions. One, because it gives to the social actors an extra element to claim and to dispute in these conflicts around environmental issues, right? Because, well, I don't exactly if was like this, but in the Rio Bogota, that has been like a very huge conflict, also has been judicialized, and there's a decision of the Supreme Court. I guess that some part of people try to express that the right of the river, right? And this is like an additional tool to the contention repertoire, I guess. But also there's like a symbolic contribution of these ideas, right? It's a very, very powerful idea that the Mother Earth had has some particular rights. And I add another interesting part. It's not the same, but that environmental issues and the Mother Nature rights, but there's also a new wave of mobilizations for the right of non-human persons, right? And also there's like some kind of combination between youth mobilization and pro-animals groups. So I think that there's a lot of mobilization in the region that can help to increase the complexity of democracy, as we saw a few minutes ago.
A very interesting talk, and certainly a lot to think about. Just a couple of quick comments. The first is, for me at least, it was the thing that needed to be explained a little bit more fully is what you mean by democracy. Because you really didn't offer a definition, but obviously you have a definition in mind. And you did mention at the end and before that earlier, the complexity of democracy is a good thing. Well, that might be, but it could also be a contradictory thing with increased participation, because the more complicated it is, the more difficult it is for people to get buy-in. But there's something else that I think you need to think a little bit more about, or maybe you haven't and just didn't fit into this paper. And that's the role of the environmental movement in the 1960s. Because as I'm sure you're aware, the environmental movement, along with women's movements and peace movements and a few others, are considered to be the new social movements that displace the working class as the only social movement. Environment is a key leader in that. And the reason I mention it, aside from the historical notion that this is an important building block in what we're seeing today, the other reason is that this way of looking at environmental movements by the members of environmental movements itself focused on the democratic qualities. So whether or not your argument is correct, and it's hard to say only because I'm not exactly sure what you mean by democracy, but regardless of whether that's right or wrong, they would say you were wrong, because for them being the people who founded the movements and who invested in it, it is democracy. And whether their vision of democracy is compatible or not with Western liberal bourgeois democracy, that still has to be resolved. And I think that one thing that is kind of coincidental, but also something to think about, is what environmental movements can do and have done in Latin America as well as elsewhere, is they can spawn other movements. And so where would we be today without COP16? And where would COP16 be today without the growth of social movements and the international, transnational pressures on different policymakers, trying to keep the UN system more responsive? Because it may be democratic to a very limited extent, but it's certainly not responsive to anybody I know. And accountability, well, we'll wait to see. And the last thing that I think, when you're looking at Latin America and environmental movements, that needs to be addressed a little bit more is the colonial legacy, in the sense that colonial boundaries really are today's boundaries in most places. And so and you mentioned this too, the nature of the boundaries has a big impact on scale. And what I'm suggesting is that you need to understand the colonial legacy to understand the costs and constraints that scalability has to face. And the last thing that I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is that if democracy is problematic for the environment, the environmentalists are wrong, the people who join the movements are wrong, then what's the solution? Because no other form of government has done better. And we look at China, we look at the Soviet Union, we look at a lot of examples of where non-democratic governments have gotten things really, really bad. And Chernobyl is probably the worst example of that. So there is a relationship between democracy, but it may be more complex in that sense. And it's something to think about because obviously the issues are very pressing. But I thought your talk was really interesting, and it certainly provoked me to think a lot, and that's good, I think. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Phil. Well, wonderful comments and reflections about the meeting. I will start with the last question or last intervention. Yeah, I agree with you that there's like a problematic link between democracy and environmental discussion. But of course, I understand that the best political regime to try to solve environmental issues is and will be still a democracy, right? It's impossible to think that other regimes, a non-democratic regime, has a better environmental protection, right? China is like, well, now it's the biggest country in terms of footprint, carbon emissions, right? And well, there's a lot of environmental problems without democracy, right? And the same for Soviet Union, or well, Cuba has also a different environmental problems, right? And it's not part of the discussion. And I totally agree with you that democracy is the best regime to try to solve environmental problems. About the colonial legacy, yeah, it's really interesting that question. We don't analyze in that chapter with Ricardo like a particular key element, but I totally understand and I agree with you that it's necessary to keep working on. And I think in some particular elements about the colonial legacy that shapes the chances for environmental claims, right? Just imagine the north of Chile, or Potosí. In Potosí or in the north of Chile, it's not possible to think to reject mining, no, because it's part of their identity, and this identity are shaped by the colonial legacy. And it's something similar. Well, it's not colonial legacy in that case, but in the Patagonia in Argentina, there are some petroleum or oil companies and a lot of different towns that they has been created for and by the oil companies. And to put some environmental claim in this context is very, very difficult because it's part of the productive identity and the collective identity of this element, right? So, well, Peru, with the mining industry, is something similar, right? So, as we point out, right, in some particular cases, the environmental mobilization is success, but it's always shaped by a political, cultural, and economical context. It's not easy to know if there's no one recipe to have success in environmental mobilization, right? And about the green movement in the 60s, yeah, I agree with you that at least in our literature review, do not identify like strong analysis for a green movement in Latin America in the 60s. Yes, there are some particular papers or books that analyze this early environmentalism in Latin America that has been part of local elites with ties, with transnational ties with NGOs. And probably these NGOs has been part of this movement of the 60s that you mentioned, but at least in our literature review, do not identify like a clear green movement in Latin America for those years. But obviously, if you have some contribution, I will read it very, very happy. And well, I think that which kind of definition of democracy you can use, it's necessary. I will still need to think it about and to find some particular definition that fits in our all this element, but I know that it's necessary to think a broader definition of democracy, non-focused on electoral competition that goes beyond the principle of one man, one vote, right? Like a regime to solve the difference, not just to choose our representatives.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I was listening with a great interest. Just one thing, no, two things. I keep my promise that it's a follow-up question. So, you said, I mean, first problem that I was detecting in the presentation and in many similar kind of writings and presentations is that this usage of environmental conflict to me is quite problematic, because as if it is environment that is starting a war against humanity, and we're just following it up. I mean, it is not an environmental conflict. It is simply that we managed to destroy some part of it in some ways, and then now it is just trying to heal. I mean, I'm putting it in romantic words, but anyway, you understand what I mean. But this is very much related to question of democracy. In your response to Phil, you were first saying that China is not a democracy, so it's the greatest carbon producer, etc. And then in the end of your response to Phil, you were saying that democracy shouldn't be reduced to electoral representative democracy. I have the feeling that there's this quite problematic understanding of reducing democracy to representative democracy, and there's a historical blindness in certain understanding of democracy, how democracy is good for environmental struggles, in the sense that it is those so-called democratic states with their industrial capitalist histories that created this whole mess, right? So in that sense, actually, like democracy that functions upon representativeness, representative democracy, that is function based on human-centered world, human-centered understanding of the world, actually is not a solution, but a problem in and of itself. And how come then that democratization, whatever we might mean by democratization, be resolving all those problems that are essentially originated in the very beginning of so-called democratization? Because we know, I mean, it goes hand in hand with industrial capitalism, right? So I think it's important to like highlight certain issues, and that's why what Phil was saying, what Phil was asking, what is your definition of democracy? Because for me, I mean, I'm also pro-democracy, but I'm quite anti-Chinese democracy, whether there is a democracy there, or I'm quite anti-capitalist democracy. I mean, capitalist by which I basically mean colonial capitalist world order, in the center of which rests the West, the so-called global North. So these are definitely not solution to our problems. So what is it? I mean, how to understand then the problems that we are going through without using those problematic terms such as environmental conflicts, and without putting democracy, like a vague definition of democracy, to as the solution to our problems, while they're actually the very origins of the problem. I'm sorry, I kept it long. Sorry. Thank you.
No, thanks you for this interesting lecture. All your comments and suggestions. Yeah, well, it's interesting that you point out that there's a lot of authors, and there's obviously some part of the literature that express that it's not possible to solve environmental issues or environmental problems in the context of capitalism. Right. So, and obviously there's a clear link between capitalism and liberal democracy. So, and if in capitalism it's not possible to solve environmental problems because it's part of are the foundations of the problem, the capitalist regime, and there's like strong link between capitalism and democracy, a liberal democracy at least, well, we have a problem. It's an unsolved problem, right? But yeah, I think that it's necessary to still working on this. It's necessary, as you said, and as Phil said also, to provide a much more precise definition of democracy. I'm still working because this has been part of a research project that I prepared in some moment, and then I left sleep a couple of months because they decided to not choose me. But yeah, it's necessary to still think in these links between capitalism, democracy, and environmental. And yeah, I agree with you that many of the elements of the mainstream views of environmental are still human-centered views, right? And that's also a problem, right? And well, the way in which we or the different authors conceptualize environmental problem, it's also part of the discussion, right? Yeah, it's not an only way to define environmental issues or environmental problems. In our definition of environmental mobilization, we try to focus at least on the part of the political and economical regulations between human and nature, right? Not taking part of a human center view or a natural perspective, right? So I try to show, well, our field of study is much more focused on environmental politics. So it's necessary, or at least it's important to us, to show the political regulations between human and nature. But thanks for your comments.
Hi, Lucas. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I found particularly, like caught my attention, this emphasis or typology you did on knowledge. And I was curious about, like, if you look, or if you could expand maybe in the processes of knowledge production, like how this knowledge that you're describing is actually produced. And I was wondering, like, if there might be something about the conditions under which this knowledge can be produced, or the capacities in terms of the composition of the people, even like, I don't know, like more educated levels, or that's not important at all. In my own experience with teachers movement, I've seen that there's a lot of like, that the knowledge that's necessarily, I mean, the production of this knowledge is very much related with the accumulated experience, interacting with the, you know, what happens with this when this industry comes here, blah, 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 or interacting with policies in the case of teachers. And probably there's like something about intergenerational knowledge on that, if we think, and because you were interested also in intergenerational justice, or yeah. And my other question has to do with, if you've seen in the studies, in the cases you've studied, how are the relations between these extractivist companies or industries and other spheres of the social life, especially like in local context. And I'm thinking particularly in the north of Chile, which you already mentioned, where the mining industry is so strong that they actually control even the education and the schools. So the curriculum is controlled by them, and then the kind of labor force they're producing also, it's super tailored to the industry, and that also mimics a lot what we had with the British Empire in the 20th century, but now it's like from the Canadian, I don't know, like industries. And how that relates or not with the possibilities for mobilizing and for producing knowledge as well.
Well, thanks, Rocio. Wonderful questions. Yeah, I think that this idea of knowledge production, it's really interesting and it's still to need thinking about. But yeah, there's some interesting process of knowledge production. And as I briefly said, well, teacher has been very, very important, not only for the knowledge production, but as yesterday, Majo told us about the spark for mobilization. And in many local towns in Argentinian provinces, the primary teachers were the spark, because suddenly they know about, okay, there's a track of a company, a mining company working in the mountains. And this neighborhood say to the local teacher, and the local teacher tells to the whole community in just one day, and in a moment previous to WhatsApp or to the instant elements of social media, right? And suddenly these women create like a micro mobilization process, right? And they create like the first assemblies. And in terms of knowledge production, has been very, very important, the role of environmental lawyers, technical people working for the government, but with a very particular commitment with the claims and with the local communities, because they usually translate the technical knowledge in like a Lego knowledge to disseminate and to be appropriate. And that's like a funny story that also acts like a spark in the process, in the conflict of Esquel in 2002. Esquel was like a small town in the Andes mountains in the province of Chubut, in the Patagonia. And a Canadian-based company wants to inaugurate a gold mine called El Desquite. Well, and they hire an engineer from DuPont. That DuPont usually it's one of the company that provides cyanide to the mining companies in all Latin America. And this guy, in a meeting with local people, said, "No, cyanide is not dangerous. You can even drink a water with cyanide and nothing will happen to you." And in the public was a secondary school, a teacher that has been educated in Universidad de Buenos Aires, and well, for life stuff, he moved to Esquel. And he said, "No, this is not true. You are lying." And this was the spark against the mining company. And obviously that was the first social organized reaction to open pit industry in Argentina, and they won. There has been first a local resolution banning the open pit mining, and then a provincial law that restrict open pit mining. Yet obviously then the conflicts is still in a latency and activation process during the following years, but has been like a very, very milestone in the anti-mining, and has that is related with the knowledge, right? Well, and the other part, yeah, the links between companies and local people, it's really strong. And in many communities, they replace the state, and that's part of the problem, right? I think that, and during the years, the companies also has learned to use local knowledge, local context to reinforce their perspective as an active player in local community. And another example of the Argentinian case, right? In San Juan, the Barrick Gold share like a rural doctor as a CEO for the part of the company based in Argentina. And this local doctor, during many years, visit the local towns and helps to the women to be healthy. And suddenly, this doctor, his name was Claudio Claudeville, he was like a very recognized doctor by the local people. And suddenly he was the CEO. And the people believe it. Yeah. And was much more easy to the company to get the social license because the people believe in this doctor. Well, they operate, right? It's part of the conflicts too. But it's still necessary to think about it because it's a complication.
I have one comment and one question from Majo that is watching us online. And I have one as well. The first is the comment from Majo. The pattern of successful movement having the alliances of powerful stakeholders in Mendoza and other places is very interesting. Diana Rodriguez Franco's dissertation, a Colombian sociologist from Northwestern, also found a similar pattern for the first big anti-fracking popular action. Rice producers were with environmentalists in the fight against fracking. That's a very interesting dissertation if you don't know it. Probably if you want, I can ask Majo to share with us. And then the question, you are mentioning environmental activism is high-risk activism. Do you have a sense of what determines this violence across countries, how it varies, and how this violence affects mobilization?
Thanks, Majo, for watching us. Well, I think that the condition under environmental mobilization can be successful or not. It's an interesting area of research, and mostly we work with an environmental coalition perspective, and in which we understand that usually in terms of environmental conflicts, it's possible to identify two broad coalitions. One is like productivism coalition, and the other is the protectionism or environmental coalition. And we argue that not only in the environmental coalition you can identify mostly social actors, but also economical actors like the rice case or the wine industry in Mendoza, but also public officers. And even in some cases like legislators from the opposition, right? It's much more complex. It's not only this old idea that the state is a monolithic idea with only one or two coordinated objectives. The state itself has like a contradictory goals, right? Between the department of the minister or secretary, whatever you want, of agriculture or energy and environmental, they have different goals. And if the local grassroots, the environmental organization read these grievances or read these gaps between public officers and they can be part of the environmental coalition, they increase, right, the possibility of success, right? But in our findings, we identify that if you have public or political actors and economic actors, and of course social actors mobilized with a very particular goal, not a collective identity. That is what we discussed with the definition, right? If it's like a specific a political goal and you have like social, economical, and political actors, you have much more chances to be success in your mobilization. And the other one, well, it's not. It's a trend in the region that Latin America is the most dangerous place in the earth for being an environmental leader. It's awful, of course, but it's not the same in every single country of the region. I think that Colombia, Brazil, and Honduras, I guess, they are the much more dangerous. But for example, in the case of Argentina, I think that it's like an idea that the democratical consensus after the brutal military dictatorship create like a space of safety for environmental leaders in Argentina. It's not possible to kill an environmental leader without a very, very hard political cost, at least in Argentina. Yes, of course, there are threats, there's repression, and there's like, well, many of the environmentalist actors usually are part of the state as the teachers, right? And they have some threats, or maybe they can be fired from their jobs. But at least in the case of Argentina, there's a frontier. Yes, no deaths, because the cost, the political cost, will be so high. In fact, in Argentina, after the crisis of 2001, in a repression, there is two piqueteros. It's like an unemployment people movement, and this fostered the president in that moment has to demit and advantage the elections, right? Because the political cost of at the death is super high in Argentina, and I think that is part of democratic pact. So it's not the same in every country in the region.
Lucas, thank you very much. I'm going now with my question. First, like a comment, when Jan mentioned about his concern on environmental conflict, I thought that in this country, at least, we have seen, and I think in Bolivia as well, and I think that in Argentina as well, and Chile, we have seen environmental conflict even among the groups, the grass groups that are working on environmental matters, because at the end of the day, it's a conflict of natural resources. So you have the discussion about, you want to, they said the industry of the toilets, when they refer to hotels. The industry of toilets is really makes an incredible impact in parts of the country. And they said, you know, here we prefer to have a port rather than having a bunch of hotels that and a bunch of people that will go to Tayrona Park and will destroy the park and blah, blah, blah. You know, there is all the time a discussion on resources. And even the how they reflect on that and how they said we are a more important movement, or we are a stronger movement, or how they compete for resources is showing the number of jobs the government take. And this is how, you know, I think that knowledge works, you know, has a, you know, plays an important role. And actually they make like a kind of characterization of the environmental impact. No, what about water? What about soil? What about air? What about all the the activities that are connected with the main activity? And at the end of the day, there is a political decision of what activity the government and the society, on the other hand, will privilege. And you know, Santa Marta is a city in the Caribbean coast, is having this discussion all the time, but all the time. It's unbelievable. And the guys that were protecting they were against the coal ports. Now that they are losing the jobs, they are protecting the coal ports. They say, no, we made a mistake. And the issue with it's really funny because they are changing. And now, last week we have a blockage from the mining industry. And actually there was like a discussion of, we have illegal mining, and as mining that is criminal mining actually, and is linked with armed groups. We have informal mining that are the mining inherited from the colony, blah, blah, blah. And we have regular activities. And what they said, this was really, I was really surprised. What they said is, President, you are against mining, and you have not realized that you are privileged, that you are benefiting the illegal and criminal mining against us and the companies. And this is what is happening at the end of the day, that is worse for the environment and is worse for the people. So, but they were people supporting the current president. And something like that happened in Peru like 5-6 years ago. And this is, and these coalitions, I think that are possible because we are in democracies. If not, we will not be able to have this kind of coalitions, and we will not have the chance to see how they are changing the perspective. Sorry, because...
Yeah, no, it was wonderful intervention. Yeah, and it's totally true. And I think that, was the other part probably of the conference, right? And this is the link between, or the tension between development and environment, right? And it's an unsolved equation, right? And every single case express this tension between development, jobs, tax revenues, economical dynamism, and environmental protection. And I don't know if it's impossible to solve, but it's really, really hard to because, for me, an interesting idea of this discussion about the tension between development and environmental protection, it's if it's possible to combine or not. And if possible to combine what scales, right? Because probably open pit mining is a huge operation in the middle of the Andes, but it's possible to think a smaller mining operation. I don't know, because I think that there's a consensus around energy transition, right? And the world decided to make an energy transition, and this transition is happening now with electromobility. And we will need minerals for that, right? And is it possible to exploit and to get these minerals? It's necessary. How much it's necessary and how much is too much, right? Because if every single people in the world wants to have like a Tesla, the world is not enough, and probably it's not necessary. But if you use the lithium from the Andes to build collective buses, collective electrical buses, probably it's something in the middle. And the middle, probably it's better a democratic decision of which is the middle that we want and we can have. But yeah, it's an unsolved problem. But I think that the most part of Latin America, this is similar. Once again, for me, Mendoza is the much more interesting case to analyze all this tension, because you have like a modern province, you have industry, you have like a much more pluralistic political system with without no re-election for the government. So, it's an interesting case, and also there's a lot of environmental mobilization. But in the south part of the Mendoza, there's like a tradition of oil companies, even the state-owned company, YPF. And in the southern part of Mendoza is the upper part of Vaca Muerta Basin. So there's a lot of pressure to exploit mining. And in some part of the discussion, around environmental issues in Mendoza, they say, okay, we are banning open pit mining, but we decide to advance with the fracking in the southern part of the province. And now the government, with a lot of discussion, right, and debates, they are creating like the district it's like the oiling and mining district in the southern part of Mendoza, and we'll try to build like a interjurisdictional, because always also include a much more one department of the south of Mendoza, that will be possible to do some economical activities that are not allowed in other parts of the province. So in the southern part of the province, that is much more desert than the Uco Valley, when the Malbecs grow, right? Well, it's like a two province in one. Right? I don't know if this will works. Probably yes, probably no. I don't know yet, but it's like an attempt to combine and try to solve this always present tension between economical development and environmental protection.
I also have a question. It's more of a follow-up. It's actually more of two or three follow-up questions put together. I liked when you were talking about the idea of dissenting youth, even though I particularly really dislike this expression, because dissenting is already somehow, stigmatizing and criminalizing the youth that is kind of fighting for our future rights. But it sort of disappears from your presentation in the end. So I was really interested in going back on José's question on what is the role of the youth in the creation of the knowledge, because when you are talking about the actors that are creating the knowledge, they appear so institutionalized, so located within the paradigms of the state, except the traditional knowledge, that I wonder where these dissenting youth, for lack of a better word, are involved in terms of the creation of knowledge. And going back also to the Democratic Pact and this idea that, there's plenty of research that says that it is precisely the youth that is losing the connection with democracy, the youth of the democracies of the third wave, that is losing the connection with this legacy of the democratic transition and losing the connection with the shared meaning of democracy that will build during this transition, right? And then you said that you don't think that the murder of environmental activists would be acceptable in some third wave democracies here in Latin America. Is that eroding with Milei? Do you think that Milei is creating a condition where maybe there will now be a different? Would you have a different evaluation now in the current political climate? So I thank you. I love the presentation.
Thanks, Claudia. Well, I think that this idea of dissident youth, it's not in a negative way, that instead is like a label that points out that it's something not expected of this young generation. That I think they have like a really, really interesting role. I don't have like a specific idea of how this youth generation are building new knowledge, but I think that it's necessary to recognize how they have been capable to create some new repertoire of action, mostly based on connective action, right? Reaching global massive. And also there's like a really, really interesting ties between like the heads of organization like Friday for Futures. I don't know if they have like an organic link, but I know that they have at least some informal network between local or national groups and other groups of Friday for Future. In Argentina, we have, and one of the founders are a student in political science, undergraduate in National University of San Martin. And he, with other 2 or 3 friends, they create Jóvenes por el Clima in Argentina. And they are very, very active. And they are constantly online creating links. And I think that this is not exactly creation of knowledge, but it's creation of repertoire, I guess. And they are, they reinforce, I don't know how to say exactly, but it has been very, very impressive. How they implant in public discussion all this idea. Well, unfortunately, the other question, I think that with Milei administration and during the last months of campaign, the democratic part was at risk, right? And it's a warning, right? I think that it's not a good scenario. And once again, right, I think that the scenario it's still very, very open, and we don't know which exactly will happen. But I think that if this guy is success in control the cyclical economical crisis, well, people can probably be less attentive to democracy legacies or to democratic practice. It's something similar. Well, it's not the same, but it's something similar to Salvador, right? These guys solved the really, really, well, it's not the same, right? But well, they changed well, even one of the main problems was insecurity. And obviously we can discuss a lot about how they achieved that goal. But the people support. And if you read the Constitution, Bukele could not be a candidate. And he was the candidate that people vote, and he was reelected. Yeah. And so, well, translating this, if Milei can fix the cyclical economical crisis, I think that there's a lot of people less worried than democracy or about democracy. So, well, it's a call of attention, I guess.
If there's no one, I will. Mine is a follow-up to the follow-up of the follow-up. Yeah, so we're following up. Yeah, just to tell two things. One of them is Paca was talking about the fight for resources. When I first started my studies in international relations, that was the only thing that they were teaching us. Yeah, humans are how you call it, selfish, and they're fighting for resources. And in 2000, Immanuel Wallerstein wrote that we have 25 more years to continue exploiting the resources. And apparently we have come to a certain end, not a definitive end, but a certain end. And that's why I was problematizing using the word environmental conflict. It is a conflict among humans. Environment has nothing to do with this. So this is the first thing. And the second thing, the term environment in itself is hugely problematic because it puts human in the center. And the rest is what is around that. So it's our environment. Yeah. And one more issue that I want to highlight. These are just the things that, you know, mushrooming when people were discussing. That's why I don't know. It's follow up to which comment exactly. But anyway, one more thing that I want to highlight is the fact that actually when we're talking about human nature relations, we're taking human outside nature. Human cannot exist in the absence of nature. So human is part of nature. It's not above it. It's not below it. It's just part of it, as simple as that. And yes, at the moment, especially with the political system, political, social, economic system that we created, and the ways in which we organize political authority, obliged us to create this distinction between human and nature, and it is becoming a constructed reality around us. But we should not simply give in to this kind of discourses that are, not us at the very least, not us, those who are thinking and writing and, talking about these issues in a more or less informed way, should not give in into this kind of discourses. um, yes, we are part of it. The nature can heal with or without us. So the question is, I will finish with a very emblematic sentence that we are able to, and we can think of the end of world at the moment, but we are unable to think of end of the capitalism, and I would add other things, but let's keep it that way.
No, cool. I really appreciate your comments, and yeah, I think that this final phrase, it's very, very emblematic, and why we can think in the end of the capitalism, but we can think in the end of the world. A couple of weeks ago, we has been discussing environmental issues in Chile in a platform for dialogue and in Calas, in the Universidad de Chile, and people from the public say, during the pandemic, I read it in a wall, another end of the world is possible. I think that, well, let's be creative.
Do we have time? Actually, it was a related point that also had come up earlier about I guess broadly the definition of an environmental movement or environmental mobilization. And I noticed you obviously referenced Joan Martinez Allier and obviously his concept of the environmentalism of the poor makes possible a retrospective environmentalism, i.e. movements in history, in time and place, that don't use the explicit language of environmentalism, but can nonetheless be understood to be ecological in scope, i.e. maybe they challenge relations of power in the rural world and so I wondered how that you factored that into your framing of what you consider an environmental movement.
So can you repeat the last part about the environmental movement?
About how definitions broadly of what constitutes an environmental movement.
Yeah, well, that's one of the main interesting findings and probably most controversial findings in this chapter on the Oxford Handbook of Latin American Social Movement, that after all this literature review, at least in the perspective of Ricardo and me, we prefer to not use the term of environmental movement, because we identify that usually obviously it's some part of conceptualization, right? If we try to apply the key elements of the ANI definition, like, for example, there's an involvement in a given conflict and there's some kind of network ties, but there's no I shared identity, right, between the groups mobilized in some particular case. So we prefer to use environmental mobilization, mostly because, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we prefer to work with the framework of coalition or environmental coalition. And one key element of this environmental coalition is that they are multi-actoral. So probably a small businessman and a local grassroots can be they can agree to stop the mining, but maybe the local grassroots don't believe in capitalism and is much more close to environmental justice ideas. And the other people is capitalism, and they don't want the mining closer to the vineyard because otherwise probably they can still exporting Malbec to Australia or Estados Unidos. So it's hard to believe that between these two different groups, there's shared identity. So for that reason, we decide to discharge the concept of social movements and talk about environmental mobilization.
Because I was thinking about new social movement versus old social movements, and I think it feel like. Thank you. I was thinking with this clarification that you're making right now, I was thinking between the difference of new social movements and old social movements. And why not to use the new social movement category? Like, what is the difference between a new social movement and a mobilization and a coalition? Because as far as I understand, the new social movement do not have a strong ties either. They do not build a subject, a collective subject idea as well. So why not to use that concept?
No, well, it's a good question. Yeah, in that moment, we decided to work with Mario Diani's definition of social movement because was, in fact, was the concept that I used for my doctoral dissertation, and we didn't think that fits well in. Yeah, it's an. I'm sorry, I missed the word. I even missing Spanish. So. It's a very demanding conceptualization, right? But for us, it's work. So we don't distinguish between a new social movement. But yeah, we can probably, if you use a social movement concept much more wide, probably you can argue that there's environmental movements in Latin America that some of the authors do.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just thinking, what role do you think poverty and bad governance play in these extractivism and environmental conflicts, especially in cases where people who are supposed to be the custodians of culture and values in this community, maybe the indigenous leaders, are the ones mortgaging the future, like all those resources, to external bodies, and they are in turn not using it for community development. Have you seen cases like that? And are there cases where they are not even mobilizing to fight against such, because they don't have what it takes to talk? And so yet they have so much resources, and yet there's so much poverty in the land. Is there anything like that? Or what do you think?
Yeah, you mentioned bad governance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that is part of the discussion. And not every single, it's once again, it's depend that how you frame or how you conceptualize environmental discussion or environmental problem. But in some moments or in some experience, there are local communities asking for much more redistribution. So they are not enough, they face to the mining companies, but not to reject the activity, but instead they claim for much more local participation, revenues, assistance, fundings. But once again, this bad governance, it's allowed by but the absence of the state, right? But yeah, I think that this is an interesting element, to identify that not every single discussion about mining or fracking are against the industry, right? And it's necessary to analyze, but it's part of what discussed yesterday with one of your works, that is the bad part of the equation, right? We don't want to analyze that community that say, okay, we want mining, but we want more money. We usually privilege to study the grassroots organization with environmental values, right? Or environmental preferences.
Thank you. Thank you to all of us who are joining us online. This is the end, so keep tuned, stay tuned. Thank you for coming, Lucas, Christelle, and